This is a short commentary on recent developments in political economy, particularly with reference to the United Kingdom. And it's entitled The Death of the Post-War Political Economy, the text of which is available on the website at the end of this short video. The actions of the Trump administration in the United States of America have become the focus of a critical media and political establishment. But beneath the inconsistencies and instability may lie more than the alleged pursuit of private financial gain and the blatant pursuit of national self-interest, the art of the deal. Like Thatcher in the UK in the 1970s, he may be a politician who has recognised the underlying economic and social changes that have challenged the current political orthodoxies. A clue to these underlying forces may be in how they are mirrored across most Western countries with the rise of the right. The post-war world embodied in the welfare state had been influenced by the extended involvement of the state in the wartime controlled economies and the consensus arising from the social coherence created by mass mobilisation. This is reflected in the UK by the landslide victory of the post-war Labour government under Attlee and its implementation of a programme of nationalisation of the heights of the economy, including the Bank of England, and creation of the welfare state. Internationally, the dominance of the USA created the free trade model of the post-war world at Bretton Woods, with the adoption of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was succeeded by the World Trade Organization, and the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The framework was designed to address the threat of repeating the interwar depression, which was characterized by financial instability and a beggar-thy-neighbour approach to trade. It represented the abandonment of a mercantilist economic orthodoxy embodied in the gold standard. Instead, global trade was financed through a system of fixed exchange rates centred on the American dollar, which effectively became the world's reserve currency, itself linked to a fixed rate of gold convertibility at $32 an ounce. Domestically, the economic lessons of the war led to the adoption of interventionist Keynesian demand management, with its focus upon the use of government expenditure and taxation to foster consistent economic growth. But as always, the world was to move on. Confidence in the American dollar was undermined in the 1970s by the size of the US deficit. This resulted in the breakup of the fixed exchange rate system, which had been characterized in many countries by intermittent exchange rate crises. The promise of floating exchange rates was to remove the balance of payments constraint and to facilitate the conditions for consistent economic growth. Instead of sudden devaluation, there were to be gradual devaluations, allowing structural adjustment in economies, although at the price of induced domestic inflation. But domestic economic conditions were also changing. In the UK, demand management failed to create the environment for consistent growth, as low unemployment was accompanied by higher inflation and balance of payments deficits. Buoyant labour market conditions, or devaluations, both created inflationary pressures which could induce a persistent wage price spiral. The result was a pattern of stop-go, which became increasingly extreme and with poor long-run economic performance. The reaction to this was an electorate turning to a conservative government with its belief in the small state, competitive markets, balanced budgets, and the principles of monetarism. This held that there was no trade-off between inflation and unemployment, the latter tending to its natural rate, determined by the underlying structure of the labour market. Expansionary economic policies, especially increasing the money supply and the lowering of interest rates, were seen as essentially inflationary if pursued in excess to achieve lower unemployment and higher growth. This challenge to demand management succeeded in reducing the inflation rate, but at the price of a dramatic increase in unemployment, increasing beyond 3 million, and hollowing out of the UK's industrial base. The Conservative government had also introduced significant anti-trade union legislation to reduce their bargaining power in the labour market. The government's determination to undermine trade union power is most forcefully seen in the defeat of the miners of the National Union of Mine Workers in 1984. Accompanying these policies was an extensive programme of privatisation, including most public utilities, the long-term consequences of which are only now becoming apparent. However, I would argue that the neglected aspect of this political change was the first stirrings of anti-globalisation. The privatisation programme was often to be a harbinger of de-industrialisation, as heavy industry, from chemicals to iron and steel, shipbuilding to heavy engineering, moved abroad in whole or in part. Hailed as an inevitable structural adjustment as the UK moved from industry to services, it involved considerable economic cost to many communities. High-paying, high-productivity manual occupations were often replaced by low-pay, low-productivity service occupations, such as the ubiquitous call centres, until they in turn moved abroad, and employment in retail or hospitality. At the same time, globalisation had affected the labour market directly as immigration rates accelerated, competing in those very service sectors and depressing wages. Indeed, it might be argued that it was the increasing rate of immigration that reduced inflationary wage pressures as much as the undermining of labour's bargaining power through trade union legislation. Thus was created the left-behind communities, as they have recently been labelled. As always with structural adjustment in labour markets, there are winners and losers. Although in theory the winners can compensate losers and in the aggregate all be better off, in the real world such compensation rarely occurs. And so the scene is set for the political shift seen across many Western countries, as the impact of globalisation began to work its way through increasing segments of a population, and as the challenge of the rising economic power of Asian countries adopting models of state capitalism became more apparent, the political climate began to change. Thus the shift to the right of an increasingly disillusioned electorate. The challenge to neoclassical free market capitalism comes not just from the interventionist large welfare state interests that have evolved, but also from the winners of globalisation, the Asian state capitalists. This model of interventionist governments with a clear economic industrial strategy, usually export orientated but with elements of protectionism, the infant industry argument, whilst at the same time encouraging an environment of domestic competitiveness between national champions, was first seen in Japan and was successfully followed by Taiwan, South Korea and most conspicuously by China. The new right-wing parties, such as Trump's Republicans, have responded, unlike the liberal establishment, by turning against the free trade model, despite the short-run costs to domestic consumers, in order to restore their manufacturing sector. However, this is likely to be more feasible for those countries with a sufficiently large domestic market. For European countries, the single market of the EU would meet this criteria and provides a degree of autarky. This, however, is likely to be more problematic for smaller economies such as the UK. It will be interesting to see how far the EU is prepared to continue to commit to the pursuit of international free trade when it has represented such a challenge to its manufacturing sector and the political demands of its electorate. At the same time, the response to the impact of globalisation can be seen in the increasingly hostile attitude to international migration. The most extreme current example is the United States, although similar hostility can be seen in the immigration policies being pursued from Scandinavia to Australia. This is despite concerns in some quarters, even within the USA, that it would have short-run adverse consequences for some sectors of the economy. Others point to the ageing demographics of most developed countries, and they're concerned about the increasing dependency ratio which will rise without continued immigration. However, the long-term benefits of immigration remain debatable. The impact of large numbers of low-wage, low-productivity labour may contribute to the declining rate of productivity growth in many countries. That is, the marginal productivity of immigrants being lower than the existing average productivity, it reduces that average. The debate is often obscured by the focus upon GDP rather than GDP per capita, which is the normal measure of the standard of living of any country, for migrants are both producers and consumers. Although it is true that the dependency ratio has been increasing with the ageing populations in Western countries, the young immigrants also increase the dependency ratio through their high birth rates. If immigrants are also exhausting existing infrastructure, both social and physical, then the long-run benefits of high rates of immigration become questionable for the indigenous population. Politically, it may also become increasingly difficult to maintain support for the welfare state and income redistribution in an increasingly fragmented society. It might be hypothesized that the USA has never adopted a comprehensive welfare state model, given its inherently fragmented immigrant origins. However, the full impact of the shift to the right in Western countries is yet to be fully realised. The clearest current example is that of the Trump administration. There are clearly several European countries that may well follow the same path. The far-right parties share many common characteristics, including their belief in the small state and low-tax economy. They also often display a nationalist orientation and so may be more sceptical about free trade. However, the electorates, although disillusioned with the existing liberal establishment, may come to be disappointed at the erosion of the welfare state with which they have become familiar in the post-war years. The contradiction between a low-tax, small-state economy and the demands of a welfare state-orientated electorate, aware of increasing inequality, may be difficult to reconcile. These contradictions will need to be reconciled within these parties, especially since there must be questions about the role of their financial interests often funding them, and the need to offer policies appealing to their discontented electorate. What is interesting is that these political changes are occurring simultaneously across the developed world, suggesting a common underlying economic cause. In this short paper, I've argued that it is the focus of globalisation that is creating this crisis. The world of free trade, with capital and labour mobility, has created tensions in societies that are finally driving change in the post-war political economy. As the ancient Chinese curse has it, may you live in interesting times.